And now we have Lara Treemore-Spears. She's a project manager within the Healthy Urban Waters program in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Wayne State University. She was a previous guest speaker at the Great Lakes Environmental Festival, where she talked about microplastics in the Great Lakes. And this year, she'll be talking about her work at CLEAR and VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. So please welcome Lara Treemore-Spears.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers. I know that this just must require so much work for this to come together every year, so thanks again for having me. So I'm a research project manager, and actually the reason I wanted to talk about volatile organic compounds today is that they tie together my other work with microplastics because of some of the volatile organic compounds that are found in plastics and certainly during the plastic manufacturing process. And the new research project that I'm working with, which is the Center for Leadership and Environmental Awareness and Research, is a Superfund research center funded by the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, and that's looking specifically at the impacts of VOCs on preterm birth in Detroit and the engineering solutions that we are looking for to try to mitigate some of those impacts. So my talk is going to talk about why we should be concerned about volatile organic compounds, the impacts in the environment, impacts on public health, a little bit about our Superfund Research Center, and then really what can we do about VOCs? Because I know that some of what I'm going to say can be a little overwhelming, and so I want to make sure that we end the talk with some positive steps forward that we can do. So why should we be concerned about VOCs? First of all, they're chemicals that vaporize readily. That creates a high exposure risk for us every time that we interact with a volatile organic compound. And they're commonly used in many products and processes. So that means they can easily contaminate the air, but also soils and groundwater when something goes wrong and they get out into the environment. Because of their impacts, they can have long-term health effects, not necessarily immediate health effects, but things that take a long time to develop. And this creates an ethical issue. This is a photo of the explosion and train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. It looks much like Manistee. It has railroad tracks going through town, and the polyvinyl chloride, which is an ingredient in plastics manufacturing that was on that train, it's a necessary ingredient in sewer pipes, for example. But we are complicit if we use polyvinyl chloride in a way that is not durable. If we buy cheap polyvinyl chloride things, we're complicit in accidents like this that may be affecting the long-term health of those communities that surround the transportation facilities and the manufacturing facilities for these substances, as useful as they are in certain products. So I think we should be thinking about that as we consider our consumer choices. So let's talk a little bit about what the sources are, because there are natural sources of VOCs, like fires, decomposition, particularly in the ocean. Certain foliage, like pine trees, release VOCs. But the VOCs we're really concerned about are the ones that are human-made. And they may be either in primary products where the VOCs serve a purpose, like in adhesives, cleaners, paints, caulks, inks, fuel, degreasers, moth repellents, air fresheners. The VOC there, that volatile organic compound that's vaporizing, it serves a purpose, like keeping that glue in a liquid form before it hardens on exposure to air. There are many secondary products, though, like our vehicle exhaust and industrial emissions, and then combustion byproducts. If you're out camping and somebody's burning plastic on the fire, even off-gassing from our cabinets and desorbing from our furniture after it's come from the manufacturing facility where they were using glues to put the furniture together. So these are all different sources of things. You may hear me in this presentation talk about BTEX, and that's short for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. These are all compounds that are very common in gasoline, so you may be getting exposed to these when you are putting gasoline in your car. There is perc or tetrachloroethylene, or PCE, which is in dry cleaning, solvents, polishes, and abrasives. These things have been out in the environment and in our products for decades now, but we are only just now finding out some of the impacts that they have. So VOCs in the environment are actually, it's pretty complicated, and so I'm going to try to simplify this because we are still learning a lot. But the main problem with some of these manufactured human-made VOCs in the environment is that they interact with other pollutants in the environment, like nitrous oxide that is in the atmosphere from coal-burning power plants and industries. And that interaction between VOCs and nitrous oxide creates ground-level ozone. And many of you have heard about ground-level ozone if you've lived in an urban area where there are ozone action days in the summer. And the reason those exist, and the reason they tell you not to gas your car when you have an ozone action day, is so that you personally don't get exposed to that highly toxic ground-level ozone that happens then. It's good for the environment, but it's very unhealthy. It creates unhealthy air for you. When it gets up into the atmosphere and travels for distance, it may acidify lakes, streams, the oceans. It may acidify surface waters. And we've even observed damage to crops and to plant vigor from the ground level ozone from that sort of interaction between VOCs and the environment. So this diagram is from a study in the tropics that shows trees actually being, and the oceans being part of what's emitting the VOCs. But once again, it's really those human-made VOCs that may exist in very tiny concentrations, but because they're so persistent, they interact with these other pollutants like nitrous oxide, and that's where the problem occurs because those compounds can travel long distances. The place where we personally interact with VOCs the most is probably our indoor environment because we spend 90% of our time indoors. And so that may come through clothing, furnishings, toys, like I just talked about. Your PVC may have gone into a shower curtain. Anything that you notice smelling really strongly after you remove it from the package, that probably has some of these manufactured VOCs in it. I read a study recently that tested things like kids' play mats, the kind that you might put in your nursery that's a very soft, mat surface for the kids to play on. They tested those in a real-world environment and found that they may be packaged as environmentally friendly and safe because they don't have lead and phthalates in them, but they still may be emitting levels of VOCs that are toxic to children and infants, particularly when you look at that children may be exposed to more than one thing. They may have 20 little plastic figurines while they're playing on their play mat. There may be formaldehyde in the pressed wood furniture or benzene in the pressed wood cabinets that are cheaper than solid wood cabinets, so many people have them. But your cabinets, carpet, even the reason you're supposed to wash brand new clothing when you bring it home from the store is that there are VOCs in many fabric dyes. And until you've washed your clothing, you may be, your clothing may be off-gassing and you may be exposed to that. Certainly anybody that is using personal care products that have a strong scent, or home improvement products or cleaners, any of those indoor products that you might be using that are strongly scented, you may be exposing yourself to VOCs. And then the part of things that civil and environmental engineers think about is what's happening below the ground surface. And so one of the exposure routes that CLEAR is working on at Wayne State University is exposure through the water and soil below the ground surface, which in urban areas may have been contaminated through legacy use and disposal of gasoline, oil, dry cleaning fluids that may have been improperly disposed of in alleys behind businesses and homes in the 1940s and 50s before people realized the toxicity of some of these compounds. And so what we're finding in many older urban areas is that those compounds will migrate either through groundwater below the ground surface or just in the soil itself. There are pores in the soil that have soil gas in them, vaporous, gaseous substances in the soil, and that can travel particularly around pipes below the ground surface and through foundation cracks, and those can enter your basement, they can enter your sump pump, and that water or air that's in your basement can be exposing you to some of these subsurface chemicals that are very common in urban areas. In Detroit, this has made the news, and actually statewide, it's been reported that 4,000 Michigan sites could be hiding toxic fumes that have the potential for vapor intrusion into your basement or through cracks in your slab foundation, and that they can pose a health threat. So this is a map of some of those sites in the city of Detroit. You can see that they're concentrated along former road right-of-ways or existing road right-of-ways where there may have formerly been businesses, auto repair shops, dry cleaners, small industries, chrome plating factories. There was a lot of industry in Detroit, and many, many legacy sites called brownfields have this sort of contamination on them. And the Superfund program, many of you are familiar with CERCLA or Superfund, which is a federal law designed to catch the potentially responsible parties for site contamination. But the problem is that many of these folks have gone out of business decades ago, but the sites remain contaminated. And then as the infrastructure deteriorates, you may have cracked sewer pipes that allow vapor to get into sewer pipes and then enter homes, along with just the aging home infrastructure. Those cracked basements can allow that soil gas directly into people's homes. So is there a safe level of exposure to VOCs? The problem is it's very complicated. The safe levels of exposure vary by the compound because there's so many different chemicals, the pathway, whether it's by inhalation or ingestion, and the dosage response, frankly, about how small the person is. Infants would have tolerance for a much smaller dosage than an adult would, how long the exposure lasts, the concentration or the total amount of the exposure, and then the interactions with so many other pollutants. There are also relatively few studies of ambient VOC exposure because the focus has been through the Occupational Safety and Health Act, or OSHA, for the exposure in the workplace. That was the first priority, is to make sure that people that are actually working in industry with these highly toxic substances, that they are safe. But what are we exposed to in an ambient sense? That's really not very well studied. Indoor exposure is generally greater than outdoor exposure, and as you might expect, winter exposure is greater than summer exposure because the house is closed up and you're not getting the sort of ventilation that you do in the summer. But we have many studies that are in process, and this extends across all of the Superfund research centers and many other people doing studies as well to look at what the impacts are of these toxic compounds on health, like asthma, preterm birth, oxidative stress, metabolic dysfunction, cardiovascular disease, and other impacts. So we do know that there are some well-documented health effects, largely from those occupational studies. We know that benzene is a human carcinogen or a substance that causes cancer, and we've known that for decades from tobacco smoke, which has benzene in it. But along with paint solvents, vehicle emissions, and other sources, we know that perchloroethylene, or PCE, is also a carcinogen. The acute effects or immediate effects of overexposure may be something as simple as irritation of your eyes, nose, and throat, or headaches, but the hidden exposure, the hidden immediate effects might be damage to liver, kidney, or central nervous system, and those things may not really become apparent until later in life, and at that point it's very difficult to trace that back to the VOC exposure. So some of what we're studying now are these chronic incremental effects of cancer, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases, inflammation, endocrine disruption, and other intergenerational effects. One of the studies that has been done in Detroit is correlating some of the preterm births that were being observed at the Henry Ford Health System with BTEX exposure, or benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. And so they mapped this along with some of the census tracts in Detroit, which is the black and white map that you see on the screen. And they found that every 5-unit increase in BTEX exposure in micrograms per cubic meter of air, that's the concentration unit for a VOC, results in 1.5 times greater likelihood of preterm birth in Detroit. And then when you look at that globally, based on the data that we do have about environmental BTEX concentrations globally, that results in about 2 million preterm births annually. Preterm birth, as some people know, can result in lifelong health effects. So Detroit has one of the highest preterm birth rate of any major U.S. city. And so developmental problems in IQ and in birth weight and other things that have long-term advantages. 14.4% of babies were born preterm in Detroit, and disproportionately, black infants are born preterm, disproportionately higher than white infants. So you might have 16% of black infants that are born preterm versus 10% white. So once again, that's an environmental justice issue, and that's one of the reasons why we now have the Center for Leadership in Environmental Awareness and Research, which is funded by the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, which is really trying to look at this urgent health problem. Is it because the flooding in Detroit has caused cracked basement foundations, so people are being exposed more? Is it because there's more impact happening from those many contaminated sites across the city? And what can we do from an engineering solution standpoint to reduce and eliminate those complex exposures? So some of the things, I'm going to go through some of this quickly just because you can look at our website, which is going to be at the end of the talk, for more detail, but we're looking at that in the lab using zebrafish, which grow really quickly, and because they're a good model of human health, we can use that to expose zebrafish and look at both their larval exposure, what's happening to them when they're just a couple days of exposure when they're very young, or we can look at non-lethal exposures, like looking at if there's behavioral effects based on how they're swimming that are sublethal effects. We can look at mice by exposing mice to benzene and seeing not only how the mouse is affected, but if she's pregnant at the time, what effects is that having on her pups. And then we're currently starting an epidemiological study where, because it's unethical to expose pregnant women to volatile organic compounds, we're doing a home survey and working with pregnant women to identify and eliminate sources of VOCs in their homes, having them wear a monitoring badge, and then evaluating the placenta after they give birth to see if there are documented effects in the placenta that demonstrate their exposure to VOC over the course of their regular daily exposure. So some of the things that we've already documented is that when you expose pregnant mice to high levels of benzene, they reabsorb some of the fetuses of the pups, which is analogous to miscarriage in humans. We've seen abnormal fetal and placental growth. The surviving mice pups have inflammatory responses in the case of males and metabolic responses in the case of females. So it's interesting that the placenta that grows is showing some of these metabolic responses, and then the pups, that translates into the pups as well. Some of the other things we've shown in zebrafish is that benzene changes some of the gene expression and the functional pathways relating to cancer, endocrine system disorders, and inflammation. We've seen changes in brain and reproductive organs. And then 1,4-dioxane, which some of you are familiar with the 1,4-dioxane plume in the city of Ann Arbor, that has the potential to change neurodevelopment, neurobehavioral development, cancer, the endocrine system, and other neurological disorders. So this work is still ongoing, where there's a lot that we don't yet know about volatile organic compounds. So the engineering side of things, we're trying to identify new ways of monitoring and remediating volatile organic compounds, such as in that basement that is receiving some of those below surface migration of contamination. And then we're also looking at ways to identify hotspots in a way that's not so costly. Right now, you can hire an environmental consultant for thousands of dollars to come out and test to see if you have VOCs. But what if we could use something like a grapevine, which has roots that go 40 feet into the ground, and it could show us that it was exposed to VOCs through its roots, growing 40 feet into the ground. So that's what we've demonstrated with 1,4-dioxane, that you can use the galls that grow on grapevines, which grow very quickly, and demonstrate recent exposure as opposed to the actual vine itself, which may be very long-lived. The gall grows very quickly. So we've demonstrated that, and we're looking at that as a low-cost way to monitor VOCs. Moving on to how to address VOCs in your own home, because the science, we're still trying to figure out the science, but there are many things that we can do. The cost of your own personal air exposure monitors has gone down a lot, so you could use a monitor to help you decide when and whether to change the ventilation in your house, such as opening a window when you're using a gas stove. You could decide which products are affecting the VOC level in your home based on the concentration and location where you use them. Whether you should be storing them someplace else, storing your paints away from where you have high traffic, making sure that you don't buy too much product at a time. You only buy what you're going to use. You don't end up storing a lot. Whether there's additional whether you should be wearing a mask when you're doing certain things with certain products, and whether you should be repairing the foundation of your house. Are you experiencing VOC migration into your basement from outside? Another thing we can do is we can research the products and materials before we bring them into our house, and certainly removing anything that might, like this plastic that might off gas, removing it from the packaging outdoors and leaving it in an outdoor location for a couple days before we bring it into the house, that can help our indoor air quality quite a bit. This is an example of just how inexpensive some of these air quality monitors are, between $100 and $300, and this is just to give you an idea that there are many on the market that you can look at. We also can use filters to help improve our air quality, so regularly replacing our furnace filter, creating a box fan filter that we run in whatever room that we're occupying in our house, or there are active carbon or zeolite air purifiers. And then this is an example of how people are using purple air. And I noticed when I pulled this map up, we don't have anybody that's using an outdoor purple air monitor in the city of Manistee. There's a couple up near Frankfurt, and then there's a couple down in the Ludington to Scottville area. So we could benefit from a few more people who feel like they're willing to put a purple air dot on the map outside their property. Because this will tell you that if you have your indoor air monitor and your outdoor air monitor, if your air quality outside is better, open up your windows, air out the house. But if it's the opposite, if your air quality outside is worse, then you might want to close the windows and use an air filter. This can be helpful if we experience the sorts of forest fire impacts that we had last year, because some of those monitors will also show you particulate matter impacts that might happen from exposure to forest fires. Many of the other presenters have talked about ways to stop generating pollution, so you all know this: better waste management, using cleaner energy, improving efficiency, driving less, and looking at your purchasing decisions and deciding if you really need it before you buy a new product that might have VOCs in it are great ways to reduce pollution. because we have a lot fewer ways to manage pollution after it occurs. There are industrial emission scrubbers, and this is a photo of a contaminated site cleanup where they're extracting the contaminated soil gas and treating it or taking it off-site for safe disposal in order to manage it. This is very costly. So even though there are potentially some solutions for ambient air remediation, like this is an example of a green wall that's at the Botanical Gardens in Ann Arbor. It's actually the soil in the potted plants that it has the microbial activity in it that can deactivate some of the volatile organic compounds, but this is very costly to fix pollution after it occurs. It's also very costly to do safe disposal of polluting products at hazardous waste collection days. So it's much better to find ways to prevent contamination before it starts. I just wanted to add this hotline number because many of us experience air quality issues outdoors, or we see contamination maybe in water sources that we're concerned about. And in Michigan, we are fortunate to have a hotline. This is staffed 24/7 off regular hours, regular business hours. It's staffed by the Michigan State Police because safe air and water quality is everybody's business. So everybody should have this number programmed into their phone because fast response in the case of pollution is sometimes the one thing that will help us to reduce those impacts. And with that, thank you so much for having me. These are the websites I mentioned, and the CLEAR website in particular has a lot more information on this topic. Check out our YouTube channel. We're adding cool videos, including ones for kids that the students at Wayne State put together for us all the time, so check back frequently. Thanks so much.
Thank you.